use and exceptions that might trigger legal review. We will also share with you what is currently available in our collection of form agreements. Keep in mind throughout this conversation that we are always looking for new ideas for new form agreements. If you have an idea for a new form, please contact us. And then finally, we will spend some time discussing best practices for working with form agreements and the 3 paths a self-service request might take. So, guys, I love this slide. We wanted to share with you up front the benefits of self-service. They save all of us time. I think that's a huge thing because there are not enough hours in the day. It empowers you to get your work done. The form agreements have been drafted with the acceptable risk in mind. We have provided you step-by-step instructions to help you complete each of our form agreements. This one you will love too. Legal review is not required unless you answer yes to one of the exception questions or if the vendor request changes to the locked areas of the agreement. We'll talk more about that later. There is also minimal involvement with the contract administration team. This probably sounds too good to be true, but it really is that easy. Now, let's talk about whether self-service is right for you. First, you must always obtain the appropriate business and budgetary approvals prior to submitting any contract request. It's not limited to self-service. It is important to note that this requirement will be true as you begin navigating through the iContract tool as a whole. If you are ever in doubt about the appropriate business approvals for your transaction or the overarching contract process, you are encouraged to reach out to the OCOO contract team for guidance. Next, selection of the proper form agreement to cover your transaction is critical. It would not only waste time if you document a transaction with the wrong agreement, but it would potentially be embarrassing and it could open the society up to unnecessary risk. Then finally, from an accountability standpoint, by submitting a self-service contract request, you are acknowledging that you have obtained the required business and budgetary approvals, you have read the guidelines for use of the form agreement, and you have read through and answered the exception questions as they may apply or not. We will talk more about guidelines and exception questions a little later. Now let's take a look at the process a self-service request will take. For purposes of today's conversation, we're going to view this assuming that 80% of the self-service requests will follow what I like to call the happy path. The first step is submission of your self-service request in iContract. The second step, the system will approve your request. In this step, you will receive an email from the system notifying you that your request has been approved. It usually only takes the system a few minutes to approve the request. What is really exciting about this whole self-service process is that at this point, the system has already generated the actual draft agreement that you will use to document your transaction. In the next step, this is where you prepare the agreement for the vendor to review. Once you have completed the agreement fully and accurately using the step-by-step instructions provided, you are ready to send the agreement to the vendor for review, for approval and signature. The expectation here is that the vendor will have no changes to the locked areas of the form, nor will the vendor request that any additional language be added to the agreement outside of the editable fields that you're free to update. And you'll learn more about that as we go along. Once the vendor signs and returns the agreement to you for ACS signatures, you should do so in accordance, you should obtain those signatures in accordance with the ACS guidelines that apply to your transaction type. If ever you need guidance on who should sign, you should always, again, contact OCOO Contract for guidance. The bright red box here represents the last step in the happy path. In this step of the process, you will create an email to OCOO Contract using the subject line, Form Agreement for Archiving, and then you're done. Later in today's discussion, we will talk about two alternative paths a self-service request might take. At this point, I am going to hand the conversation over to my co-presenter, Lori Sheehan, for her to share with you guys what we mean when we talk about form agreements. Lori?
Thank you, Sharonda. So what are form agreements? Well, first I wanted to back up a little and just remind everybody that as corporate counsel for the society, we have a legal and ethical duty to protect the society. Our primary goal is to help ACS achieve its mission without exposing the organization to unnecessary or unacceptable levels of risk. And with transformation, the legal department gained much better visibility to field operations across the enterprise. Not only did we get a better sense of the various types of transactions occurring, but also perspective on the volume and frequency of these transactions. We needed to mitigate the risk of our broad field operations, but in an efficient manner that would allow us to leverage resources. So we looked for transactions and engagements that we could standardize from a contracting perspective. We identified transactions that were high volume, but fairly consistent with a lower risk profile, like transactions without any privacy or tax implications. Then we crafted form agreements with provisions to cover the risks associated with these standard engagements. We also placed a high priority on ease of use for field staff. So we set up the agreements with 4 form fields that you can just tab through to insert the business details. But the majority of terms, as Sharonda mentioned, are locked and can't be edited. We also created step-by-step instructions for each form agreement to help field staff understand how to complete them. Also, we recognize that field operations often involve tight time frames and minimal resources, so our aim was to create agreements that would be generally acceptable to vendors and other organizations that we do business with, but would protect ACS's key interests. And the result was a broad suite of form agreements that have now been loaded into the iContract tool with guidelines for their use. So it all sounds great, but how do you know if a form agreement is right for your transaction? And I'm going to hand it back to Sharonda to guide you through that.
Thank you, Lori. So now that you know the benefits of using these new forms, we talked about the process, and you know what a form agreement is. Let's go ahead and talk about how you determine the appropriate request type to document your transaction. This slide is a high-level view of the 3 main paths a user might take. More specifically, you will note that the diagram is broken down by event staff, health systems, and then all other staff. To help guide you to the proper method of documenting your transaction via iBuy, iContract, or Society P-Card, it is recommended that you follow the Where Do I Start diagram to identify the proper path for your transaction type. The Where Do I Start diagram, along with the How to Procure guide for event staff, will be available for your ready reference on the iContract Society source page. For event staff, if you follow the diagram, we have asked whether your transaction relates to a facility, product, or service. If yes, you will follow the How to Procure guide. Over on the right side of the screen, under the document list, this list will show you the self-service requests that are available for event-related transactions. The same is true for health systems. Although there is no How to Procure guide, that's the only difference here. The important thing for you guys on the health system side of the house to note is that if there is not a form agreement in the document list for your transaction, you should always create a generic contract request. Finally, if you do not fall into one of the categories we just discussed, forms that are available for all other transaction types will be on the Other Staff diagram. Same thing here regarding the document list. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the actual forms available in each of these groups right now, as Lori will cover that in the next couple of slides. Let's move into how our collection is organized in iContract. These boxes represent the main buckets of our current collection. For example, in our department-specific collection, we have forms for corporate IT, the content team, the enterprise facilities management team, and research, just to name a few. In the event-related area, general health systems and sponsorship are some of the other overarching categories. At this point, I'm going to hand the presentation back over to Lori for her to walk you guys through our collections and to talk about the guidelines and exception questions and some tips for working with our form agreements. Lori?
Thanks. Okay, so I know you're all dying to know what all these form agreements are. And so here's a snapshot of our current inventory of form agreements. We've organized it here by the categories that Sharana pointed out for ease of reference. But examples of some of the form agreements in OCC's current collection are in the event-related category. We have products and services vendor agreements for single or multi-event use. We also have facility use agreements, as well as form sponsorship agreements for relays, drives, and other events. On the mission side, we have form agreements for health systems collaborations like Patient Navigator and similar mission partnerships. There's a new hospital confidentiality agreement, and we also have form agreements for programs like our Hotel Partners program. The general form agreements can be used by any area of the organization and include agreements like a non-disclosure agreement or speaker engagement agreement. And finally, there are department-specific forms like Sharana mentioned. The departments we have right now are corporate IT, research, revenue, marketing, communications, and the content team and book publishing. And as Sharana mentioned, this is a growing list. We're currently working on more. For example, I'm about to add an agreement for Liquid Feel Better for use with health systems. And we're always looking for opportunities to add more. So if you have an idea for another form agreement within your area of responsibility, please do let us know, and we'll make it happen if we can. We also want to continually improve our form agreements, and this is a point that I want to make sure to make. If you're encountering difficulties with a form, either difficulties completing it or maybe you're getting consistent and constant pushback on a particular provision, please reach out to us because we might be able to consider whether we can make modifications to the form to cut down on requests for negotiation, or we can make adjustments to the form to make it simpler to complete or understand. So again, please reach out to us. We do want your feedback. Okay, so now I want to talk a little bit about the self-service request guidelines that Sharana has been referencing through here. As I mentioned before, the form agreements have been created to address particular types of transactions, each with a certain set of perceived risks. If a transaction falls outside of those boundaries, then legal needs to reevaluate the risks to make sure they're being addressed. The way we've articulated these boundaries, or guidelines as we call them, is by a set of exception questions that apply to each form. These are usually about half a dozen or so yes or no questions that are meant to flag potential high-risk circumstances that could be present. As long as the answer is no to each question, then you meet the guidelines and you're good to continue without legal review. But I do want to stress that you need to walk through and answer the questions to ensure that the transaction meets the guidelines each time you use a form. It is likely, with many other things, that the guidelines will be adjusted and improved over time. So you really need to walk through them each time you're submitting a request. And remember that by submitting a request, you are confirming that you've taken that step. If you do answer yes to any exception questions, that means there's potentially a higher risk associated with the transaction, and legal will need to review the agreement. And one point I just wanted to make here is that even though legal review may be required if you answer yes to an exception question, it doesn't necessarily mean that the form that you won't be able to use that agreement that you started to complete. It's possible that we may want to move you on to a more robust agreement, but we may also just add a provision or two to address any concerns we have, like for privacy or branding issues. Again, the key point here is that the transaction must fit the form, and the guidelines are going to tell you if it does. So I want to go over a few exceptions, examples of exceptions that might trigger legal review, just to give you guys some context. On this slide, we've listed a number of sample circumstances that can heighten the risk and maybe exceptions to the use of certain form agreements, and I'm not going to go over them all. I would encourage you to do so and also to read the exceptions every time on your form agreements. But I just want to highlight a few and tell you why they're important. Many of these are on here because they have tax implications. For example, exclusive arrangements with vendors can be problematic for our charitable tax status, and we need to evaluate those. Any lobbying or advocacy activities need to be evaluated because we may need to report the activity to meet federal or state regulations. If there's external funding for the agreement, like government funding, we'll need to review it and ensure that all the compliance obligations are met and that we're passing along any compliance obligations that are required. Access to data or ACS systems is almost always an exception question because it's an area of high risk to the organization, both legal and reputational risk. And if you look at the event-related list, you'll see a number of activities that present higher risk to ACS, either because they may fall outside our normal insurance coverage, or they may be areas where we have seen high exposure or financial loss to ACS in the past. So we want to make sure we're covering those risks. A final note is that any contracts that are nationwide in scope, such as nationwide sponsorships or vendor agreements, will require legal review. So where do you find the guidelines and exception questions? Well, because they're so important, we've included them in a number of places. They will appear in a couple places in the iContract tool, which I'll show you in a minute, but they can also be found in the Legal Information Database, or the LID, as we call it, that's available on the source. And just a side note, the name always cracks me up because it gives me flashbacks to when it was truly a Lotus Notes database and we had no internet at all. So that is why it's called the Legal Information Database. But you can navigate to the LID on the source by clicking through any Legal for Me link on the source and locating the Resources for Me box you'll see on this slide. Then if you look on the Legal Information Database box, you'll see where the red arrow indicates that there's a Contract Collection tab. If you click on the little triangle to the left of the Contract Collection tab, it will pull up links to all the various forms. And if you select a particular form agreement from that list, it'll pop up the guidelines and links to the instructions and the form agreement itself. So this is a really great place to refer to. On the next slide, you'll see where the guidelines appear in the iContract tool. You first access a self-service request via the iContract tool under My Place, My Request, and New Request. And I know that was covered in some detail in the video. But when you're selecting a particular self-service request type, the guidelines will be in the box beside the request type, which is the box at the top of the slide. Secondly, once a request type is selected and you're completing the information required for the request, you'll be able to view the guidelines in the box with the red border. Also note, there is a link at the bottom. It's highlighted by that red arrow that you can cut and paste into your browser to go to the instructions available on the lid. So if you get within the iContract tool and you want to pop back out and refer to the instructions or guidelines on the lid, use that link to do so. Okay, quick tips. So once you verify the guidelines are met and submit the self-service request, the system will generate a draft form agreement for you to complete. And as we mentioned before, the form agreement will contain form fields that you can just tab through and edit with business details. The completion instructions available on the lid will explain what we're really looking for in each of the various fields, but I wanted to go over some general tips that will apply to almost all form agreements or any legal agreements for that matter. So I'm going to highlight just a few. The first one is always use the vendor's complete legal name and address. And here I just want to make a note that often you'll hear us use the term vendor in the contracting process, and that is just shorthand for the other side. So it may mean a grantee or a hospital or a State Department of Health or any other collaborating organization. But OCOO and legal often just use the term vendor kind of as shorthand. You'll also see that term used within the iContract tool, and it's meant as a general reference to the other side. So again, use the full legal name of the other side in any contract. It's difficult to enforce an agreement against the other side if you can't positively identify them or locate them. So we need to be exact with that. Also make sure the responsibilities and obligations of the parties are clearly stated. In some of the form contracts, they're going to be mostly populated for you, such as in some of the mission partnerships. But in other contracts like vendor agreements, you will need to fill in the specific responsibilities of the vendor. The standard you should always use when you are including that information is would a reasonable person with no prior understanding of the deal know what's really expected and agreed to. You have to cover the who, what, when, and where, and we want you to be specific. The one I will say that gets probably left out the most is when. If there's a deliverable, there should usually be a deadline for that deliverable or some sort of expectation of timing. One that relates mostly to event contracts, but I think is important to note, is that if ACS has obligations, like if you're obligated to provide a certain space or access, then that should be noted in the agreement. You should also be verifying that it's reasonable for ACS. The final one I just wanted to note is please proofread. There aren't that many fields to complete, so you want to make sure that they really reflect what you intend. I'm going to go on to the next one. Yes. Now I want to review with you the 3 different paths your self-service request can take once you've completed a self-service request in iContract. The first path, Sharonda's happy path, is the path of least resistance. And again, it's the path we anticipate most form agreements will take. It means you meet the guidelines and the other side has accepted the terms without changes or additional language edits. And they sign the agreement and return it to us for ACS signatures. But there are 2 other possible paths. Number 2, if you don't meet all the guidelines and you answered yes to one of the exception questions, then legal is going to need to review the contract. And number 3, if the vendor requests change to the terms, and by that we mean a change to the locked terms, then it's going to trigger legal review. If they're requesting changes to the business fields that the business already has the authority to populate and modify, then it's going to be completely a business call as to whether you accept any of the vendor's changes, and that won't trigger legal review. Certainly, it's your responsibility to evaluate whether they're acceptable to ACS. And if you ever have questions or would like legal's input or guidance on that, feel free to call us. We'd be happy to just give some side guidance on that point. Now I'm going to let Sharonda walk through these steps in more detail.
Thank you, Lori. So, back to the happy path. Now, the way that the lawyers have drafted our form agreements, they're very fair, they're balanced, and, we typically have not gotten a lot of pushback on the terms of our agreements. With that being said, just to reiterate what Lori said, if you are consistently getting pushback on the same provision, or if something is just not clear, if a vendor is confused about what we mean by a certain thing, definitely let us know. Don't spin your wheels trying to figure it out. And also, don't get discouraged when a vendor asks a question. A lot of times, we can help them understand our position, and they usually ultimately agree to sign the agreement. So with that being said, the happy path. This is where, the guidelines worked for your transaction. It's where you answered no to all of the exception questions. You got your agreement, and that second step of the process we looked at, you've completed it fully and accurately. You've emailed it to your vendor. They have signed it without any questions, without any request for additional language, and they've returned it to you. At that point, we're here in this top box, obtain appropriate ACS signature for the document. When it comes to that, you want to make sure that you follow the ACS signature guidelines. There's a document available on Society Source if you type in division signature guidelines, or you can always reach out to OCOO Contract for guidance. Once you have the vendor signature and the internal authorized ACS signatories, you want to send an email to ocoocontracts@cancer.org. Guys, if you're taking notes on this slide here, there's an S on contracts for OCC's OCOO contract mailbox, so please make a note of that. I would hate for you to send a note and it not be delivered. When you send that email, in the subject line, you want to type fully executed form agreement for archiving and attach the signed copy of that form agreement. Path 2. I like to call it the exceptional path. It's the exceptional path because you answered yes to any of those exception questions Lori discussed earlier in the presentation. Whenever you answer yes to one of those exception questions, again, it doesn't mean that that request type is not right for you. It just means that there's greater exposure and that legal will need to review that agreement. I will say here, though, that when we're starting with our form agreement, it makes the review a lot faster. It's very streamlined because, we're only looking at, minor changes to our form. So don't let that, discourage you because you answer yes. I don't want that to be, a mindset of trying not to answer yes when yes really is the right answer. To request legal review in this exceptional path, again, you're going to draft an email to OCOO contracts, and in the subject line of this email, you're going to type form agreement for legal review. Attach a copy of the contract that you downloaded from iContracts and complete it. Be sure all the fields are completed before sending, of course. Once received by OCOO, the agreement will be assigned to a lawyer or paralegal for review. You will be copied on the assignment when that happens, and you'll work with that contact to complete the contract process.
I want to interject one point on the exceptional path. When you do submit it, the form agreement for legal review, please make a note of what the exception was and why you're submitting it so that legal can quickly get to the root of what our concern might be and address it and move the document as quickly as possible.
Lori, thanks for that. That's great feedback and really important, guys. If the vendor, even if they've taken and marked the document up by hand, because again, it will be, and I'm jumping ahead a little bit. I get so excited. I'm still happy from the happy path. But again, you always want to provide as much explanation as possible around the yes response or any requested changes by the vendor. So path 3 is just that. It's a vendor detour. You were rocking along all fine. You were happy in that path, and then they said, hey, I have a question, I have a comment, I'd like to see this different. It's important to note here, though, that if the vendor is requesting changes to any of those editable areas that you completed initially, that's fine. With that being said, that's not an opportunity to squeeze in an additional provision because it is editable. It really, you really should only put the information in those editable areas that are appropriate. Again, we're not, if you need a special form agreement to cover something that's routine and regular in your business, call us. We're happy to work with you to create something that would work for your business. So again, once the vendor has requested those changes to that locked area of the agreement, legal review is required. You're going to send an email to OCOO contracts, and in the subject line, again, it's form agreement for legal review. And you will attach that agreement that is in question, providing as much detail as possible.
Right. Include the detail about what the vendor has requested to be changed. You could do that either by scanning and attaching a PDF. It may be that the vendor just wants to hand mark it, and that's the easiest way, considering they won't be able to edit it. Or you could just submit it in the text of the email. That would work as well. But you know, to make the process go as quickly as possible, if we can have that information, as an attorney reviewing it, if I can know what the ask is on the front end, then I can review it and move it more quickly.
Awesome. Thank you, Lauren. So I do, before we move on, I do want to say, you know, really, with self-service requests, all of the paths are happy paths. It just got weird saying happy 3 times and then happy 2 times and then happy once. So we're really excited about this opportunity for you guys. So Lori, at this point, is going to cover a few do's and don'ts of our form agreement.
Okay, great. And again, I'm not going to go through every single bullet, but I want to highlight the ones that are near and dear to my heart and jump out at me. Again, as I mentioned before, please do read the guidelines and exceptions carefully every time to make sure that your form fits the transaction. That's the whole point. These are customized for a particular transaction. Please make sure it's appropriate. Also, and especially when you're first getting accustomed to using the form agreements, do read the entire agreement carefully, not just the provisions that you need to complete, but read the entire agreement so you understand what the deal is. It's your deal, and you need to understand it. I mean, vendor may have questions that if you have read the agreement and understand, you can answer. If you have any questions about the provisions, please call us. If you're concerned that a provision might not be appropriate or reasonable for your particular deal, then call us and we can help advise on that. Then rely on the agreement to kind of set the framework for the transaction. We've tried to set these agreements up in a way that contemplates and includes provisions that would protect ACS. You will be prompted to complete the key business terms. Make sure that you get a fully executed contract before starting any work. And remember to follow the ACS signatory guidelines when collecting ACS signatures. Do also make sure you get a fully executed copy and forward it to OCOO contracts for processing and archiving. Getting it to OCOO is not only important so that we have a complete record of our contractual obligations of the organization, but it also can affect payment processing and what have you. It needs to be in the system, or you might run into issues issuing payment off the contract. And also do contact legal anytime you have questions about the form agreements themselves, or if you have any suggestions for improvement or new forms. So the don'ts. Don't start a form request until you have the business approval for the transaction. And again, that may vary somewhat by the business line, so please contact OCOO Contracts, their contracts administration team, if you have questions about what business approvals are required. And also, and this goes again, kind of a flip side to the do, is don't try to make a form work if it doesn't fit the transaction. We've tried to contemplate what these forms would cover, and we've tried to make them as broad as possible. But if you read the agreement and if you have concerns that it doesn't fit what you're trying to accomplish, please don't use it, don't force it. Contact us and we can help. Also, don't rush through the agreement. Remember, and this is kind of goes hand in hand with the proofreading, remember that it will become a legally binding agreement, so don't rush through. Don't have any oral or side agreements that are not contained in the agreement. Everything we want and expect has to be in the contract. It doesn't really work to say, well, it doesn't matter, both sides understand what the deal is. No, that's not the way it works really in legal contracting or in legal interpretation. The contract is the deal. And so even if you both have some separate understanding, if it's not in the contract, for the most part, courts aren't going to look at it. There's a legal rule of contract interpretation. It's called the Four Corners Doctrine, and it just means that if there's a dispute, then a court is only going to look within the four corners of the contract to interpret it. So unless there is an external reference or some blatant ambiguity, they won't even look at evidence outside the contract. They'll only look at what's written in the contract when determining how to enforce it. Also, don't allow performance of the agreement to start until it's been fully executed by the both parties. That's just unnecessary risk and exposure for APS. And finally, don't allow modifications to the terms without submitting for legal review. And to Sharonda's earlier point, because a field is editable and because you're allowed to add text, please don't be dropping in indemnification provisions or additional language like that into a editable field to kind of bypass the process. If you have any questions about whether something is an acceptable change or something that has more of a legal effect, just pick up the phone and call us, and we can give you that advice quickly. Now I'm going to hand it back to Sharonda, I think, to wrap up.
Yes, I did want to just put a few reminders out to the group around, use of the self-service agreements. Certain ones of them, especially in the event area, will reference very, very specifically what the exceptions are. If you had taken Legal 101 or our special events and insurance hot topic calls, we talked a lot about what our high-risk categories are, what things are prohibited, what, the use of waivers and minors and things like that. The self-service agreements do not negate any of that. You still, if something ends up being appropriate, if a waiver is required, we try to reference that in the description box of the actual request. So be mindful of those type things as well. And whenever you're uncertain, do not hesitate to reach out to us for guidance. So I wanted to talk a little bit about who to ask and where to go for help. With our new clients and our new ways of working together as an enterprise, I know that for most folks out in the field, when you send things in for review, it appears to be one continuum of, process. So I wanted to really try and help you guys understand, who to go to for what. So on the OCOO contract side of the house, again, you're going to go to them about getting started. If you have questions about that business and budgetary approval that is required for your transaction type, whether you are at corporate center or in a division, that is the place to start. If you need support navigating through the contract process, OCOO does an amazing job of helping to provide guidance, support. They will spend as much time as is required to help support you get your job done. Then again, how to complete a self-service contract request. So the request, it's the same process. However, there's a request that's you're going to submit to generate the actual agreement. If you need help with submitting that in iContract, call OCOO Contract. If you need help trying to figure out how do I get access to iContract, OCOO. If you're looking for the status. Now the great thing about self-service, because you're doing it yourself, you really should know the status. You're in complete control. There may be times if there's a request that has been out there for a while, OCOO might reach out to you to find out, what's going on with that transaction. And then anytime you're having system issues, OCOO is a good first point of contact, or certainly you can contact the help desk. Now on the legal side, if you are trying to determine and you're stuck on what self-service request type to use for your transaction, that's legal. If you need assistance beyond our step-by-step instructions on how to complete the form agreement, call us. Substantive questions about the structure of a transaction, requests for new form agreements. We've tried to really drive that point home today that we really are looking for opportunities to empower you guys to get your work done faster, to save all of us time. And then if you'd like to request deeper dive training for your particular area or with your team. I will say we probably, now that we've done this, we are planning to do yet a deeper dive into, because this is really like a 101, I think, but deeper dive by constituency, so by event stat, by community engagement, by mission and health systems, and then for that other group as well. So if you're interested, please let us know on our Yammer page, let our talent partners know. Feel free to reach out to Shamra, and we'll help to coordinate getting that done for you guys. So as we wrap up our call today, the formal presentation piece, because we are going to open the floor for questions, and I'm going to ask Shamra if she will facilitate that. I hope you see how easy and empowering this new collection of form agreements and the self-service requests and I-contracts are. And while I call them new, I will say that these forms have been posted since February for your use on Society Source. We were not able to communicate in this manner, so we're really excited to get this out to you guys. Remember that legal review is not required. There is minimal involvement with the contract administration team, and we are all protecting ACS and gaining more time to finish the fight. Again, we're reiterating here on this slide about the resources that are available to you in the Office of the Chief Operating Office. And then, again, I always want to make the plug, when you are engaging your vendors, to talk to them and give them the heads up that, we have our own agreements, and if they use those, that, they can sign it today as is with, no request for changes or additional language. The process is quick and easy, and because the agreement, again, can be signed, work can begin, and they can get paid. Thank you so much for your time today. This concludes the formal presentation part. We will open the floor for questions. As Shamra mentioned at the top of the call, if you registered for this call via Society Pathways or not, there is a demo on our Yammer page. Please go out and take a look at that. There is an actual demo of how to complete the request in the iContract tool, which is really cool and helpful for you guys. Shamra, with that, I'm going to turn the presentation back over to you.
Perfect. Thank you, Sharada. Okay, we did have a question from Patricia asking, will these be only for when revenue or venues are involved, or she asked specifically about volunteer agencies being part of this?
It's not just venues or revenue. There are a number of other form agreements that apply to vendor engagements or hospital collaborations that wouldn't fall under one of those two categories. I'm not real clear on what type of volunteer agencies we're looking to address there, but I would be happy to entertain a discussion on the side to figure out if we have a form agreement that would apply, or if not, if we could create one for you. So I kind of encourage you to reach out directly to us on that. I think there was another question about the third-party fundraising. If there was someone that was hosting an event and wanted to donate proceeds to ACS, is that the third party, the local third party?
So there's a third-party cause and there's a fundraising agreement. We actually happen to have one of our other esteemed colleagues with us today that does some work in that area with some of the local fundraising relationships. There is a form available in the iContract tool. It's under the general category, and it is called the fundraising agreement. And in parentheses, it will have local next to it. If you read the guidelines for that and that it doesn't seem to be what you're looking for, feel free to either reach out to the regional counsel that is assigned to your division. Many of you may be used to working with Paul Nesbitt, Jared Golden, or Jennifer Bumbalow. June Casey and Cassandra Hibbler are also really good resources for you guys if you can contact someone directly. And then alternatively, you can always call our main number at 404-327-6423. Any other questions for us, Shamra?
No, that was actually it. We don't have any other questions in there. You guys have answered all of the questions that were in the chat box.
Awesome. Well, this is not your last opportunity, guys. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, the plan is to host some additional sessions by constituency where we go into greater detail and look at the actual form agreements. We can talk a lot more specifically about the types of transactions that you're interested in. In the meantime, feel free to reach out to us either on Yammer, either by our mailbox, or by giving us a call. That concludes all I have today, Shamrock.
Perfect. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And we just encourage you, you will receive a survey, so we ask that you just go ahead and fill that out also, so we make sure that we are meeting your needs as we are developing further resources and training opportunities and calls and such. And again, just if you have any questions, reach out to them on Yammer or through Society Source, or you can also email them with the email boxes that are listed here on the screen, as well as calling the 1404 number, 327-6423. And we appreciate you guys giving up your time. Thanks so much. Have a rest of the wonderful day for those of you that are just about finished, and for those of us that are halfway through our day, enjoy your lunchtime.